Good morning. The Commissioners are conducting concurrent hearings today, so I will conduct this hearing. The other Commissioners will refer to the transcript and the recording of this hearing and may have follow-up questions in due course. Ms Hayward, would you please stand and state your full name for the record?
Pauline Patricia Hayward.
Will you take an oath or affirmation?
Affirmation, please.
Please. Proceed. Are you going to assist in that? Thank
Sorry.
you.
I, Pauline Patricia Hayward, sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence that I give to this Commission shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing.
Thank you very much. Please be seated. Mr Evans.
Thank you, Commissioner. Professor Hayward, you have prepared for the purposes of this Commission a second witness statement at the invitation of the Commission, is that correct?
I have.
That is dated the 27th of August 2021. Do you have a copy in front of you?
I do.
And that is your signature on the 21st page.
Yes, my copy is not actually signed, but I did sign it at the office the other day.
Thank you. And the contents of your statement are true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information and belief.
They are.
Attended. Commissioner, document GWC.0003.0018.0001.
That document. Thank you. Ms Spencer.
Thank you, Commissioner. May it please the Commission. Professor Hayward, the purpose of today is to explore some further topics with you and, if necessary, just clarify your evidence and some of the matters which Mr Futrell covered with you back in May. Firstly, I'd like to take you to the GWC Act, specifically the part of the Act which deals with the duties of the GWC. If we could call up PUB.0004.0005.0107, please. And just page 125, please. Just warming up. Now, if we can just scroll through slowly, page 125 down through to 127, you'll see section 7 there, Professor Hayward. Now, at the time you were a GWC member, were you familiar with section 7 of the GWC Act?
Sorry, I'll have a closer look now. Sorry. Could you go back to the start of 7, please?
Sure. So just page 125, please. And we see it goes across the page and then finishes on a page. If we scroll down to 127 as well, please. Now, I'll just ask my question again, Professor Hayward. At the time you were a GWC member, were you familiar with section 7 of the GWC Act?
In my view, yes.
Yes. And if we could just go to page 126, I just want to zoom in on section 7, subparagraph 1BA, please. This is the top half of page 126. Now, you see that there. One of the duties was to formulate and implement policies for the scrutiny, control and regulation of gaming and wagering, taking into account the requirements and interests of the community as a whole and the need to minimise harm caused by gambling. You see that there?
Yes.
You recall this provision?
Yes.
Now, during your time on the GWC, do you recall if the GWC formulated or implemented any policies that were contemplated by this section? So for the scrutiny, control and regulation of gaming?
Definitely that.
What policies can you recall?
We had policies around, so I'm assuming that you mean different to the WA appendix?
Yes.
Because that,
Sure.
in essence, was a policy in its own right.
Yes.
So I would note that in particular, but there were deliberate considerations of things like gaming machines, their placement, the numbers of them, the cost per game, things like that. Now, whether that found its way into a designated policy that had policy written on it, I wouldn't be able to tell you, but certainly those. And ditto to minimising harm caused by gambling, although that was a frequent item on our agendas and discussed frequently throughout the course of my tenure.
Okay, and as far as you're aware, was that encapsulated in a document anywhere?
Part of my, I'm doing my best to answer you, but there have been so many documents that I've read through in the last couple of days especially that it's a little difficult for me to know, did I recall in that moment or am I recalling because of something that I've just read?
Okay, I understand. Now, I'll move on to electronic gaming machines, if I may. I'll refer to those as EGMs, and I want to explore with you the GWC's approval process.
Yep.
Now, you talk in your latest statement at paragraph 51, the process of the GWC in terms of authorising new games at the casino, but you make particular reference to EGMs and that an evaluation is undertaken as to whether or not a machine is too much like a poker machine, and that's at 51.3 of your statement.
Yes.
Now, during your time as a member, Professor Hayward, you were aware, weren't you, that there was a prohibition within WA on poker machines?
Yes.
Now, in your statement at paragraph 52, you refer to the government having a long-standing policy. You see that there?
Yes.
Did you understand during your tenure on the GWC that the prohibition was in fact written law under Section 85 of the GWC Act?
Yes, I certainly understood that it was in the Act.
Okay, and also Section 22 of the Casino Control Act?
Yes.
I'm happy to bring those documents up for you.
No, I do recall.
You recall that?
Yes.
Now, back in May, do you recall an exchange with Mr Futrell where you gave evidence about the GWC providing in principle approval to Burswood or Crown as they were at the time, and then that approval often followed a presentation by people from Burswood or Crown? Do you recall that evidence?
Yes.
Yes. I can take you to the transcript if you would like to.
No, that was in accordance
with
with normal process.
Sure.
So yeah.
Now, is it the case that in the assessment of an EGM, the GWC considered more than just whether or not the game was a poker machine?
Yes.
Now, in terms of the discussions that the GWC had when deciding whether or not to approve an EGM, in your statement at 51.3, you refer to House advantage, rules and Crown's reasons for introduction of the game. Now, are those things, do you make reference there only to games, or does that also apply to EGMs? That list there.
To EGMs as well, is my recollection.
Sure. Could you just explain to the Commissioner what it is you mean by the House advantage in the context of an EGM?
My understanding is that goes to the at least 90% return to player.
Okay. And when you refer to the rules of the game, in paragraph 51.3, could you just explain what you mean by that?
When we considered any proposal for a new game, the conversation went to things like what's different about this game to what has been in the past. Generally, when Crown Casino presented to us, they would liken it to a previous game. So if there had been a game by a particular game manufacturer and a game type that had been previously approved. They would say, this is like that, or it's like, there were 4 or 5 different game manufacturers. They all had their own style of game, and generally what we were looking at was new artwork on really the same game over and over again.
Could I just check with you what you mean by artwork?
Yes, all the visuals that one would see. So if there were particular pictures,
Okay.
they would change depending on the game. The rules tended not to. They were the same. The way that the pictures appeared was in keeping with whatever was the type of game. And we also considered things like how many games, whether or not the number of EGMs proposed was in keeping with was under the ceiling of how many EGMs there could be in any case, where they would be placed in terms of gaming facility within the casino, and the various cost per game.
And where they were placed in the casino, you just mean their footprint basically in the casino, where they would sit.
Yes,
in comparison
yes.
to all the other.
And some of that, I mean, most of it, as I'm sure you would expect, was on the main gaming floor, but there were also other areas like the Pearl Room or the International Room or things like that. They tended to not be, the EGMs were not so popular in those places, but once again, it wasn't a surprise to us that in the more high-end part of the venue, the cost per game might also be higher than on the main gaming floor. So we looked at all of that.
Okay. And the third point you make in paragraph 51.3, you make reference to the reasons given by Crown Perth for the introduction of a game.
Yes.
Now, can you think of any examples sitting here today of reasons which Crown Perth gave over the time in which you sat on the GWC?
In terms of that 51.3 and that last sentence, yes? No?
Yes. Well, the first sentence of 51.3. Oh, sorry, it is the second sentence. You're correct.
Okay. Generally, and once again, without things getting to a process where it was just routine, so you don't need to consider it in specifics, because every game was considered in specifics, every game was demonstrated. It wasn't just, oh, this is like that other one, so please tick. It wasn't any time like that. But the main reason coming forward in terms of why a new machine, even if it's that same game type, was to keep the punter's interest.
Okay.
Essentially, if someone likes a particular style of game, they may well appreciate the same style of game but with different artwork, potentially different features, to keep their interest. Does that make sense?
That does, thank you. Can you think of any other examples of reasons that Crown Perth or Burswood gave as to wanting to introduce new EGMs?
It was mostly about keeping the punter's interest.
Okay. Now, when the GWC is considering all of these factors when reviewing an EGM, what sort of weight was attributed to each factor? I'm interested to know what was one particular factor, for instance, considered to be more important to the GWC than another?
I think for me the standout was the game type. That was, not that I've played any of these games, I must add, but if there was a tile turnover, that was my preference in seeing it and considering it for approval, as opposed to the game type, which was rolling balls.
Okay.
I and the other commissioners, gaming and wagering commissioners, were always keen to have verification that those rolling ball type games fitted within the time per game. They always looked as though they were going faster, but we did have those tested specifically. So the timing of the game was always a really important consideration, and I think if in looking at all of the various considerations that we gave to any new game request, that would have been top of the list.
So would it have been given greater weight in the decision-making process?
I think so.
So yes, so say for example you had 3 reasons, would you attribute a third to each of those reasons, or
No,
would
the
something like
timing was always paramount.
Now, was there a handbook or anything like that which set out a process for making these decisions?
I don't recall, to be honest.
Or any other kind of document, perhaps, which set out the sorts of questions that you could ask the presenters from Crown or Burswood?
I didn't ever feel that we were limited in terms of anything that we wanted to raise. So if, for instance, on that last example, if it was the rolling balls and we really wanted to be clear that each game took at least a certain amount of time, then we might ask for further information, we might ask for testing. Otherwise, I didn't ever feel restricted in terms of, oh no, that's not a question that you can ask. If people had a question, it was open in terms of us asking that.
I see, thank you. Now, just turning to paragraph 52 of your statement,
Yep.
You set out the key differences between an EGM and a poker machine.
Yes.
Being that EGMs do not have a spinning wheel display and must be started using a start button. Now, the start button is self-explanatory,
Yep.
But could you just explain to the Commissioner as best you can what you mean by a spinning wheel display?
For me, and once again, I have never played a poker machine. So
Or EGM?
yeah, but to be able to compare.
Yes.
So this was very much that things had to be played, and I suppose whether or not you won a particular game it was always left to right, it was by line. How to compare that with an actual poker machine and how that worked, in not having played it, it's hard for me to differentiate.
Do you recall ever receiving any advice or guidance from the GWC or from the department, perhaps, about the difference between an EGM and a poker machine?
It was often in the conversation.
In what conversation?
Any of the conversations about game approvals.
Within the GWC meetings?
Yes. And once again, as you can imagine, for me, the rolling ball style of game always was the closest representation to what I would expect from a poker machine. So that was a particular interest of mine. And that, how is this different? Is it different? Was part of that kind of conversation.
And did anyone give you assurance of the difference between that rolling ball that you were concerned with and the poker machine?
Yes, that assurance came from the department.
Was it from a paper or a particular person at the department? Do you recall?
Not any particular pattern, sometimes from a person, sometimes within the paper.
Now, if we could just call up document GWC.0002.0016.0035_R. Now, perhaps if we, this is an agenda paper for the September 2011 meeting. That's just scrolled down, Professor Hayward, to page 407. This is item 8.2. Now, if we could just have a scroll through these pages, you'll see there that it's a differentiating between electronic gaming machines and poker machines. And that's quite a detailed note on the difference there. Do you recall seeing that document? Appreciating it was 10 years ago.
Look, it doesn't surprise me that it came, but I even in scrolling back the picture where there was the poker machine, it doesn't leap forward as, yes, I definitely remember that.
Sure. Now I'll just take you to the minutes of that meeting. So that's GWC.0002.0016.0046. And if we just go to the first page. So this is the meeting on the 27th of September of the GWC 2011, and you'll see there in the present that your name appears there, Professor
Yes.
Haywood.
Yes.
Now, if we just go down to page 9, and just looking at item 8.2, about 3/4 of the way down the page, and you see the resolution there
Yes.
to approve the electronic gaming machines policy, and that was the document I just took you to in the agenda just before.
Yep.
Now, does that refresh your memory as to whether or not you were given guidance as to the differentiation?
Oh, that certainly is what that shows. I just didn't have a recollection of it.
Sure. Now, if we could go back to the agenda, please, at page 414. Now, can you see there that there is a list of principles the GWC applies to determine that a machine is not a video poker machine?
Mm-hmm.
And there's 5 factors there.
Yes.
So we've got appearance, player interaction, speed of play, winning combinations and symbols. Now, does that accord with your recollection of the principles you applied as a GWC member in assessing proposed EGMs?
Yes, certainly all those matters were discussed in terms of whether or not a game was given in principle approval, but I don't recall us ever sitting down and going, okay, what do people think about appearance? What do people think about this? But all those things were in the mix.
Okay. And I think I know the answer to this question, but I'll ask it anyway. Yes. But do you recall ever referring to this document at all during your tenure? So I'm just curious to know whether, say, when you were assessing an EGM, whether you'd have that, the members would have that document with them.
Not that I recall.
Okay, I'd like to now keep on the topic of EGMs,
Yes.
but ask you some questions about the speed of play. Now, just before we leave this document, you see there at point 3 that each game takes a minimum of 5 seconds. Now, when you were last before the Commission, you gave evidence that, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the speed of games was essentially the lapse between games so that it gave a player breathing space to think about whether or not they wanted to stay playing or walk away. Do you recall that evidence?
Yes.
I'm happy to bring up the transcript if you would
that
like.
sounds right.
Now, can I just confirm that speed of play you were talking about there, was that in an EGM context?
Yes.
Yes. Now, in May...
And I think only in an EGM context.
Thank you. Now, in May, you also gave evidence that you didn't ever see a policy manual per se by the GWC. And you said that in the context of questions asked by Mr. Futrell in respect of looking at elements of games which required GWC approval, and in particular in respect of the element of speed of play. Do you recall that exchange with Mr. Futrell?
I think so.
Yes. Again, I can bring up the transcript.
Yeah,
if you
no,
want.
that sounds right.
Now, do you recall from your time on the GWC considering EGM speed of play issues and approaches from Burswood or Crown to reduce the length of games?
Yes, definitely.
Now, I'd like to bring up, I'd like to look at 2014, Professor Haywood.
Yes.
If we could please bring up document GWC.0002.0016.0129. Now, if we go to item 5.2 on page 2, now this is a document you might be somewhat familiar with, Professor Haywood, as I see you referred to it in your last witness statement at paragraph 53. So these are the minutes from the GWC meeting on the 25th of March 2014, and you'll see on the first page, if we could just have a look at the first page, and you'll see that you were an attendee of that meeting. Now, moving to item 42 and what it is minuted there, could you just read that to yourself?
The 5.2?
5.2, please.
Yes.
And just let me know when you've had a read of that.
Yep, thank you. Yes.
Right. Now, what I'd like to ask you about is the second paragraph. It's just one sentence in that paragraph. So now the second part, that sentence says, the Deputy Director General was requested to liaise with Crown Perth with a view to decreasing the game speed by a further 20%. You see that there?
Yes.
Now, you say in paragraph 53 that you don't recall the consideration given to increasing the minimum speed of play for EGMs, but there is no reference in your statement to the agenda for that item. So I'd like you to just show you the corresponding agenda documents which relates to those minutes I just took you to.
Yep.
So if you could please bring up GWC.0002.0126.0126_R. Just at starting at page 22. So this is the agenda you'll see on the top of that page. Now this is from 22 to 52. If we could just scroll through that slowly. I don't expect you to read. It's 30 pages we're going to scroll through, but just to see if any of that jogs your memory at all. If we could just slow down the scroll, that would be great, please. All right, so that was the agenda item, all the documents that went with that. Now, does that assist at all in refreshing your memory as to the discussions at the March 24 meeting and why the Deputy Director General was requested to liaise with Crown about decreasing the game speed by 20%?
I don't know that I recall. My assumption, however, is that it looks as though Crown had come forward with that request and that the Gaming and Wagering Commission required more information about that. I think in Mr Preston's letter, he references that particular point. If we could go back to that.
Yes, sure. So I think that was, if we could just scroll up till we find Mr Preston's letter. It was one of the last documents. And just if we start at...
Hang on, so yeah, the next page, hang on. I thought I spotted in that quick scroll that there was something about the timing. Perhaps it's on the next page.
If I could perhaps just draw your attention to this in the minutes. So
Yes.
the Deputy Director General was requested to liaise with Crown Perth with a view to decreasing the game speed by a further 20%. So essentially making the game longer as opposed to shorter. So perhaps the opposite, I think, perhaps to what you might be thinking of.
Yeah, I know for me, and which is why we did have it tested, the rolling ball style of game always, to me, looked quicker
Yes.
than tiles being turned over across the screen. So every time there was a game type that was like that, we went to the same conversations.
Yes. And so I think if we look scrolling through that agenda item, some of the images, were they the balls that you were concerned about?
Yeah, it felt faster.
Sure. And I'll just, if we could scroll up to the pictures on the PowerPoint on this agenda. We might just have to, I'm unsure of the exact page number, so we might just have to scroll up until we hit it.
It's a shame actually that you don't have access to the video clip, because that showed the movement as well as just it's moved and here's what it looks like.
Yes. Is it these sort of things that
Yes.
you were concerned about?
Yeah, not so much the pictures that are there
Yes.
when you reach this point, but it's how you got there. It's the ball actually rolling down the what looked like a test tube, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, if we could just flick back to the agenda item 5.2, please. Oh, sorry, on the minutes. So that's GWC.002.0016.029, just on the second page there. Do you recall the Deputy Director General, which we'll see from the first page of the minutes, was Mr Michael Connolly, I believe, at that stage. Do you recall him reporting back to the GWC about slowing down the game?
I don't recall specifically.
Sure. And now, just looking at that item 5.2, Do you agree with me that looking at these minutes, that the GWC's attitude at this time was to decrease EGM's speed of play, so in effect making the games longer?
Yes.
Do you recall if it was just the ball delivery system, or was it across all EGMs?
My recollection is that it was specific to the ball delivery
Okay.
style of game.
All right. Now, you refer to, in your latest statement, again at paragraph 53, to having refreshed your memory by looking at the GWC's agenda for its 2014 meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll just bring that up now. That's GWC.0002.0016.0115. We could just show the first page. And then scroll down to page 9, please. And you'll see there, this is item 4.1, so the matters to be actioned. And the first item in that table there is for the Deputy Director General to liaise with Crown. That's what we were just talking about, that Mr Connolly was going to go away and talk to them. Mm-hmm. And then it says a verbal update to be provided at the 24th of June meeting. You see that there?
Yes.
Now, if we just turn to the minutes, if we could please bring up GWC.0002.0016.0116. And if we, just the first page, thank you. And we can see, Professor Hayward, that you attended that meeting there, and that Mr Michael Connolly also attended as the Deputy Director General.
Yes.
Now, turning to the bottom of page 1, you can see there 4.1, little I, electronic gaming machines, speed of play. There are 2 short paragraphs and it spreads over the page there, yes. If you could just read those 2 paragraphs to yourself. Now, do you know if anyone at that meeting asked Mr Connolly how he made those inquiries with Crown Perth?
Not that I recall. When Mr Connolly reported to us, it was just directly in terms of that meetings or conversations had taken place.
Okay. Now, there's a reference there to adverse consequences in the second sentence.
Yes.
Are you able to give the Commissioner any insight as to what consequences Mr Connolly was referring to?
I can't recall in terms of the specifics of this meeting. Once again, my assumption is about revenue.
And what specifically in relation to revenue?
In very, very general terms, not related to this matter specifically, the more people are playing more games, the more money rolls in, essentially.
Now, on page 2, it refers to unwanted outcomes from increasing game length. You see that there?
Yes.
Do you recall what that was about?
I don't.
Now, I'd like to stay on the topic of speed of play, but move to a later time period, being 2019. Do you recall that the speed of play, or the length of game, if you like, reduced from 5 seconds to 3 seconds during your tenure on the GWC?
Yes.
Now, do you recall the GWC meeting on the 26th of March 2019 when Mr Felsted, Mr Preston and Mr Sullivan came and presented on Crown's proposed amendments to the WA appendix?
That sounds familiar.
Okay, I might bring up the agenda item if I may. That's GWC.0002.0016.0268. And if we could just show the first page is subject to a non-publication order, so perhaps just private screens on the first page, please, just so we can see what the document is. See that there, Professor Hayward, that it's the 26 March 2019 agenda for the GWC?
Yeah, I have no doubt about that date because it followed the routine pattern of when
Yes.
meetings happened.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, if we could just go down to page 76, please. Now, if we could just, so this is referring to the presentation that I just asked you about.
Yes.
That they would, Mr. Felsted, Preston would come and deliver a presentation to the Commission. If we could just scroll down slowly, please. Now, starting on this page 77 is a letter from Crown dated the 7th of March 2019 to Mr. Ord as the chairman of the GWC. If we continue to scroll just slowly, and if we could pause on page 79.
Yes.
Now, so the bottom half of page 79, you'll see the table there,
Yes.
and at point 2 there is a proposed increase in the speed of game from 5 seconds to 3 seconds. You see that?
Yes.
It's the track change document there. Now, there's also a reference at point 4 to reducing the return to player from 90% to 87.5%. You see that there?
Yes.
Now, if we could scroll down to page 83. So we're staying on it's the letter of the 7th of March 2019. So this is the last page of the letter, and you'll see there in the second, the paragraph there about responsible service of gambling.
Yes.
If I could draw your attention to the second paragraph. And you'll see there's a submission there from Crown that the proposed amendment, so that's the third line of the second paragraph, that the proposed amendments to the appendix will not have any impact on gambling-related harm. You see that there?
Yes.
Yes. Now, if we could just bring up the minutes, please, for this meeting. That's GWC.0002.0016.0271. Now, page 1 just on the private screens, please. If you just keep that extract of that letter in your mind, if you would. Now you'll see there, Professor Hayward, you were an attendee of this meeting on the 26th of March.
Yes.
Now if we scroll down to page 4, which can go on the public screen, this deals with item 6.4, amendment to the WA appendix, and you'll see there that the presentation lasted about 45 minutes. So the first line says, Mr.
Arrived?
Yes,
Yep.
when they arrived, and then at 8:45, leaving at 9:28.
Yes.
Now, what do you recall of this presentation?
It was a little unusual because Mr. Felsted didn't usually attend Gaming and Wagering Commission meetings, so that was a bit unusual in its own right. And to me, and I dare say the other GWC commissioners, it pointed to the importance that Crown Casino was placing on the matters being presented.
Was that specific? Did Mr. Felstead say anything to that effect, or is that just?
No, that's just my assumption.
Okay.
It's what it felt like at the time.
Did you have a discussion with the GWC members about that assumption that you had?
I don't recall.
Okay. Sorry, if we could just go back to what you recall
Yes.
from this 45-minute presentation.
Yep. Sorry. The it's not the presentation as much as the conversation that followed that is in my recollection. Generally, if someone was presenting something, they would present. There were questions along the way where that was relevant.
From the GWC members?
Yes, yes. And there wasn't, the body of the discussion followed whoever was presenting their exit from the room. So you didn't kind of discuss a whole range of things in the presence of whoever was presenting. And for me, it was the two main things, which is what you've pointed out in the letter in any case, one about the speed of game and the other about the return to player. They were the main two aspects of our discussions that followed.
Okay. Now, just if I could step back to the presentation, I just want to exhaust your memory on that point, if I may.
Yep.
Do you recall in that particular presentation that questions were asked? I know you said that questions were generally asked, but do you recall in that presentation?
My recollection is that there were questions.
Sure.
Why this? What will it mean? That sort of question. And certainly in terms of the speed of game, there would have been questions around what are the extra features? What does that mean in terms of before someone moves from one game to the next game, as opposed to what's the timing of the base game without those added on features? That certainly would have been in the questions asked.
Okay. And so would you describe that presentation as an interactive presentation?
I don't know that I'd go so far,
Okay.
to be honest. I mean, to me, interactive is kind of where it's on par.
Yes.
These would have been
Like a
specific
conversation.
questions that, yes.
Okay. So it wasn't really...
No, there were questions asked and certainly they were addressed, but I wouldn't call that interactive.
Okay. And 45 minutes, was that quite a long presentation?
Yeah, definitely.
Compared to what you had previously?
Yes.
Now, I just want to test your recollection of Crown's submission, which I took you to earlier, that will not have any impact on gambling-related harm. Do you recall if that was specifically interrogated by the GWC members to the presenters?
I don't know that it was specifically considered. Indirectly, it was considered in terms of the point where one game was started and then the next game was started. Because that was seen to be related to harm minimisation as opposed to somebody just pressing, then indirectly it would have been, but I don't know that it was asked so specifically.
All right. Now, do you recall the agenda paper in July 2019 which dealt more substantively with Crown's application that we were just discussing there? I'll bring up the agenda for you. So
Yeah,
that's
if you wouldn't mind.
GWC.0002.0016.0281. So it's agenda item 5.3. Perhaps if we scroll through that slowly, please. And there's that letter again from the Crown. If we just scroll through that, please.
So I'm taking their letter as the submission.
Yes.
Yes?
Are any of these documents seeming familiar to you, Professor Hayward?
They are. If I sound hesitant, it's because I wouldn't be able to tell you how much of that was recollection of the time and how much of it is.
In the last few days?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Understand. Now, you refer at paragraph 54 of your latest witness statement to your understanding that in-game features of EGMs was extending the overall game speed to in excess of 5 seconds.
Yes.
Now, do you recall if Crown provided you, well, by you I mean the GWC, with details of the proportion of EGMs that were affected by this?
I don't remember that.
Okay.
I do remember in the, and I don't know if it was in this specific presentation, but when a presentation was made about any proposed game coming to the GWC, we saw what you're not seeing, and that's actually the video. So you could see the speed. You could also see, if there's a winning line or outcome here, these are the sorts of features that come up. So we had that overall picture.
Okay. Did the GWC at any point ever call upon an independent third party to verify how many EGMs in the casino that this affected? This bonus feature extending the game time?
I know that we used the GLI ones that did this testing. I can't recall whether we asked for that testing or whether Crown Perth asked for that testing.
Okay. Now, you say in paragraph 55 of your latest witness statement that you recall a robust discussion on this issue of reduction of game speed.
Yes.
Now, before I ask you about the content of that discussion, I want to ensure that we have the timing of that discussion right. If I could just bring up the minutes of the meeting of the 23rd of July 2019, so it's GWC.0002.0016.0285. Now, if we could just go to the first page, please. You'll see there, Professor Hayward, you were an apology to this meeting.
Is that a good thing? Sorry.
Now, with that in mind, does that give you some perhaps I'll take you to the item. If we just scroll down. So that's item 5.3 there, and you'll see there was a resolution to approve the changes to the WA appendix.
Providing there were additional features.
Yes.
Yes.
But of course you weren't at this particular meeting where the resolution was passed.
No, although it does accord with the conversations that we had. previously.
Yes, so that was really I just wanted to show you that so we could get some timing around these robust discussions that you talk about in your witness statement.
Yes.
So was it perhaps the March 2019 meeting you're recollecting those robust discussions?
It may well have been.
Okay. Could you just, as best you can recollect, tell the Commission about those robust discussions, which might have been in March 2019, between the GWC members about this application or submission from Crown?
My recollections of, I guess, the attitude that I had in reading in advance of that meeting, the submission by Crown Perth was, like any business, a business is under pressure to make more money. So there was always a level of, maybe not suspicion, but at least scepticism around what is this really about, and are we simply being asked to endorse this because it brings in Crown Perth more revenue? You know, that was I think it would be fair to say that was always at the back of our minds, while understanding that Crown Perth is a business and that's normal for business.
Sure. So was there anything that the GWC did in the context of this submission to help alleviate that scepticism or concern?
Yeah, lots of that was, I guess, aligns with the reference that I just made to actually seeing the videos.
Yes.
Because you then, even if someone had had a stopwatch, you know, anything like that on any of their gadgetry, you could actually time what does that look like from when you press play through to the end of that particular game. So it was actually about watching those videos and having a look at the timing in a real-time sense.
Yes.
That alleviated some of that.
So there was the aspect you were considering, the business aspect, and there was a bit of scepticism perhaps about why you were being asked to approve this. So that was part of this robust discussion you refer to. Can you think of any other things that were discussed amongst the GWC members?
As well as the speed of game was that second element about the Crown Perth's proposal to reduce the return to player. So they were the two main items that were in that GWC discussion.
And what was discussed in relation to the return to player proposed reduction?
That was a pretty easy blanket no,
I see.
to be honest.
Now, appreciating that you weren't at the meeting in July 2019, do you recall if you provided any feedback on that proposal in advance of that meeting, knowing that for whatever reason you weren't there, but did you submit anything to be considered at that meeting in your absence?
I don't think I did.
Okay. Were there any discussions, shall I say, offline, perhaps like in between the meetings that you had with any of the other GWC members?
No, in fact, I think we had each other's emails, but not necessarily each other's phone numbers and things like that. But even in the context of, you know, if you did a reply all on something, you would get everyone's emails. But I don't think, not just I don't recall, I don't think that there were any out of session conversations about it. Certainly not that included me.
All right, thank you. Now, do you recall ever receiving a copy of the revised EGM policy after this meeting? Perhaps I'll show you the document. That's GWC.001.007.0192. We could just scroll slowly through that document.
once again, this is familiar to me, but I couldn't say to you if it's because it was familiar at the time or familiar because of the reading over the last few days.
All right, thank you. Now I'm just going to move to October 2018 now.
Yes.
If we could please bring up, and this on the private screen, is it just page one? Just page one. It's gwc.002.0016.0256. I think it could go on the public screen because the pages I'm going to take you to are not subject of a non-publication order. So perhaps we'll just go to the first page of that document to show what that is, please. You see the agenda, GWC meeting, 23 October 2018. And if we could scroll down to page 115, dealing with item 6.5. Crown Perth presentation, EGM win celebrations and game approval process. And it refers here to Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Bossy will attend the meeting to conduct a presentation on EGM win celebrations and game approval processes. See that there?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I use the phrase a loss disguised as a win, what would you understand that to mean in the context of an EGM?
I don't know.
All right. That's all right. I'll take you to, if we could scroll to page 122. Perhaps if you could have a read of this game to yourself.
Yes.
Does that provide any, if I use the phrase loss disguised as a win, does that provide any assistance in what that might mean?
It doesn't really, because when I think about a loss, I go to that video 1 no game win, so the win value is 0.
Yes. And how about video 2 small game win, bearing in mind there's a bet value of $1.50?
Yep. Okay, so it's less than. It sounds like it's one of the features. It might also be related to within a game, so I won't go back to the rolling balls, but rather the tile games. You could, a player could nominate whether the game was only considering one line or a pattern of lines or all of the tiles, and if it was one line, then that's harder to get than if you've nominated all of them. And my thinking is that it probably lies in that somewhere.
Sure. So was the phrase loss disguised as a win ever used in your time at the GWC?
Not that I recall.
Okay. Perhaps if I now take you to the minutes of that meeting, so we're looking at item 6.5, and the minutes are GWC.0002.0016.0259. And if we just go to the first page, just so we can see the attendees, please. And your name is second on the list there. Yes. Now if we go to page 3, please. Now halfway down the page, item 6.5, you'll see that it was minuted that after Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Bossy from Crown left the meeting, members discussed the issue of flashing lights and music being played when the player has not won more than they bet. Do you recall that at all?
That does sound familiar.
Now, you'll see that there was an agreement to consider going to Crown in December that year to view the win celebrations on the EGMs, but that the GWC would wait for Mr Preston's presentation on EGM risk management next month. Do you recall that?
Once again, that sounds familiar.
Do you recall the concern about the music being played when the player has not won more than they had bet? So what I have described as the loss, described as a win.
Yeah. My recollection of that conversation is that the more sort of bells and whistles, in colloquial terms, the more enticing it would be for the player. And if you weren't winning, it shouldn't be celebrated as a win.
Sure. So that was the concern of the GWC?
That's my recollection.
Now, just going back to the plan to go to Crown in December 2018, but waiting for Mr Preston's presentation first. Now, do you recall that Mr Preston was the Chief Legal Officer at Crown Perth?
Yes.
Now, it wasn't until December 2018 that Mr Preston presented to the GWC on Crown Perth's responsible service of gaming. Do you recall that presentation?
I think so.
I will take you to the agenda item. So that's, it's actually in the November 2018 agenda paper. So that's GWC.00016.0260. And again, if we could just show the first page. See there, that's the agenda for the November 2018 meeting. And if we scroll to page 13, please. Now, this is in response to the VCGLR 6th review of the casino operator.
Yes.
Now, if we're just going to scroll through this agenda item 5.2 and 5.3, just slowly, just to see if that helps refresh your memory on this topic. There are quite a few pages to get through, so, but if you need me to slow down, please let me know.
No, I think I've read this document in the last few days. I think.
We'll just continue to scroll then so you can...
Yep.
That. And then item 5.3 here just notes that Mr Preston will come to the meeting for a presentation on risk management system for electronic gaming machines. Now, I'll just take you to the minutes of that meeting before I ask you some questions about that presentation. Yes. This will need to be on the private screen, please. It's gwc.002.0016.0250. If we could start at the first page, please. So it's the 18th of December 2018 meeting. You see you're listed as an attendee at that meeting?
Yes.
Yes. And if we go to page 2, items 5.2 and 5.3 there. Now we can see at 5.3 it says Mr Preston attended at 9:16, and then later in that item it says he left at 10:14, so he was there for the best part of an hour. What can you recall about that presentation from Mr Preston?
Once again, I can't be certain how much of my recollection is from the time versus reading documents over the last couple of days. In terms of the VCGLR item, the overwhelming, I guess, impression that was built was about the differences between Crown Melbourne and Crown Perth, and but going through the recommendations that pertained to Crown Melbourne, in case any had relevance in the Crown Perth context, and having a look at them recommendation by recommendation in terms of, in some instances, it not being relevant, and in others they're having some relevance but steps already being taken in Crown Perth in terms of addressing those recommendations, even though they weren't specific to Crown Perth.
Was the GWC, in your view, provided with sufficient comfort in respect of its response to the VCGLR review? How you said there was the comparison between Melbourne and Perth?
I think so.
How would you describe the level of engagement between GWC members and Mr Preston during that presentation?
I'm not sure if this bit is going to answer your question, but any time Mr Preston attended a GWC meeting, my impression of him was that he was open to any questions. You certainly didn't feel like you couldn't ask questions. I didn't ever feel that he was flippant or dismissive in his responses to questions. So he seemed open, and if we had a question, then he certainly struck me as doing his best to respond properly to that question. Does that?
Well, that answers my question. Well, that answers it in a general sense.
Yes.
But in terms of perhaps turning to just this meeting specifically, do you recall, for instance, any specific questions that were asked by GWC members at this meeting? For example, did you ask any yourself?
I think I would have, but I don't recall the specifics of either any questions I might have asked or others, actually. The differences between Crown Melbourne and Crown Perth, between Victoria, gaming in Victoria and gaming in Western Australia, were often in conversations, but I couldn't say to you whether that was specific to this.
Do you recall if the GWC as a whole understood Mr. Preston's presentation? By that I mean, was there anything that perhaps, whether anything needed clarifying at all? Or were you satisfied that all the queries were covered?
I don't recall that. I think part of his accessibility in terms of the information that he was providing is he spoke in a way that could be understood rather than so into jargon or industry-specific principles that if you weren't full-time in the industry you wouldn't be able to understand. He didn't do that.
I see.
Ms Spencer, would it be a suitable time?
I do have
Yes,
just
carry on.
three
and
more
then we'll
questions
have
on
a
this
break.
topic and then remarks.
Very good.
Thank you,
Please.
Commissioner. Do you recall if Crown was asked to improve on anything after this presentation?
I don't recall.
Now, we saw there that item 5.3 in the agenda was EGM risk management.
Yes.
Was that ever touched on in the presentation as far as you can recall?
I can't recall.
And was there any discussion about this issue that I described as the losses described as wins? What we were talking about before with the flashing lights when there wasn't,
Yes.
when the player actually got less than what they had, the money they had put in. Was there any discussion about that particular aspect of EGMs?
While I recall those discussions, I couldn't say to you that it happened here.
With Mr. Preston in the
Yes.
room? Okay. That would be a convenient time. Thank you,
Thanks
Commissioner.
very much, Ms Spencer. Thanks, Ms Hayward. We'll adjourn now for 15 minutes and resume at 11:35.
All rise.
Sorry, this is going to have to be right there.
Yep, okay.
Page 14, sorry.
Hayward. Spencer.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now, Professor Hayward, apologies for jumping around in time, but I'd like to go back to August 2018.
Yes.
Now, do you recall 2010? Do you recall in 2010 that Burswood was looking to expand its casino operations?
That does sound familiar.
All right, I'll just bring up the agenda for August 2010, and just on the private screen, please, gwc.002.0016.0017. We could just show the first page, please. You'll see there that's the agenda for the Gaming and Wagering Commission, August 2010. And if we could scroll down to page 15, please. Now this is item 4.2. You'll see it is in relation to the redevelopment of the Burswood Entertainment Complex. Do you recall this agenda item?
Once again, I don't know that I recall it from the time, but I do recall it from the last few days reading.
Perhaps we might scroll through the whole agenda item if you'd like.
Yes.
There are quite a few pages, but perhaps if we just, and you let me know if you'd like to slow down on any particular spot, just to help refresh your memory. So maybe we'll deal with this in parts. So if we keep going to page 37, this is a fairly extensive letter from Mr Felsted from Burswood to Mr Sargent as the chair of the GWC.
Yes.
All right, and if we could go back please to page 15. There's more to the agenda item, but I thought I'd just deal with it in bite-sized chunks.
Thank you.
So page 15, you'll see there Mr Beecroft,
Yes.
a Principal Policy Officer, prepared that paper, and you'll see that Burswood was seeking approval to increase the number of EGMs. You'll see down there at the background, the second half of the page,
Yes.
increase the number of EGMs by 250, the number of gaming tables by 50, and the area of the licensed gaming floor. You see that there?
Yes.
And then, so we've just scrolled through the letter or submission from Mr Felsted. Now, from page 38, if we could go there, please. Now, this is the impact assessment prepared by, I think, someone at the department. Do you recall at the time reading through this document?
I don't recall specifically.
Sure. Well, how about was it your usual practice when you got the agenda papers that you'd read through everything? Yes. Okay. Perhaps if we could just have a scroll through this impact assessment in relation to the proposed increase in gaming capacity. Do you recall seeing impact assessments a number of times during your tenure on the GWC?
Not frequently, actually.
All right. And when we get to page 45, if we could please pause there, operator. Now, page 45 here, you'll see deals with harm minimisation. Now, perhaps if you could just read through the first, perhaps just read through that page and let me know when you've finished
thank
that.
you. Thank you.
All right. Now, if there is a reference in the first half of that page to some prevalence rates found by the Productivity Commission in 1999, do you recall reading the Productivity Commission's report at all?
I don't recall that.
I'll clarify that there were two. There was one in 1999 and then another in 2010. Do you
No,
recall
I don't
being
recall.
provided with copies of that?
Look, I couldn't say that we weren't, but I don't recall.
Okay. Now I'll just take you to the minutes where this item was considered. If we could bring up GWC.0002.0016.0015, please. You can see the third name down, Professor Hayward, you're an attendee
Yes.
at that meeting. And if we just go to page 2, there's the item 4.2 and the resolution to approve, in principle, the expansion, the introduction of fully automated table games, an increase in the EGMs, and note the intention of Burswood Limited to commission 125 EGMs within the licensed area.
Yes.
Now, do you recall the discussions between the GWC members in relation to this agenda item?
I actually don't. My recollections are much more in line with over time, so several instances where Crown Perth came about their whole footprint, not just the gaming floor footprint. Yes. So that picked up on restaurants and other areas in the whole of the footprint. That's much more in my head than this.
Than this specifically, I see.
Yes.
Now, the reliance on the low prevalence, which the Productivity Commission found in 1999, did you or any other members of the GWC question that reliance on those figures at the time? Bearing in mind, so this was August 2010, and these are figures from some 11 years earlier.
I don't remember. I'm sorry.
Well, looking back now, do you think it was appropriate to be relying on problem gambling prevalence figures that were 11 years old?
I don't know how worthwhile it was to rely on them, but one of the differences, of course, in the WA context compared to not only Victoria but other eastern states is the casino is the one place. And there was often conversation around that. It's not like you can be casually walking past somewhere and there's a gaming machine or there's an opportunity to bet. It's you have to deliberately go there to be able to do it, or to game, and that difference was often in the conversation.
All right.
That's not this specifically. I appreciate.
Yes. Well, thank you. Now, are you aware whether the GWC, during your time as a member, initiated any of its own research into the prevalence of gambling harm in Western Australia?
I don't recall that we did. There were conversations in terms of some research that was being done nationally rather than in the context of WA, and I don't recall the GWC ever commissioning any ourselves.
Now, just back to my question, I think you answered. I just want to check that there's nothing that you can recall from discussions about this item in August 2010.
Yeah, I don't think there is.
Okay. Now, in July 2010, so a month before this, Mr. Sargent tabled a letter from a Professor Dorbay on behalf of the
yes.
Public Health Advocacy Institute of WA.
Yes.
You recall that document?
I do.
All right, I might just bring that up on the screen for you. So that's gwc.002.0016.0012, and on the private screen, please. If we just scroll down to, so you'll see there's annotations at the top right where it says tabled.
Yes.
So if we scroll down to page 5, actually that's, yes, thank you. And if we could get page 6 alongside it, if that's possible, please. Thank you. Do you recognise that document, Professor Hayward?
I do. Once again, I'm not too sure how much of that recognition is from the time or from my recent readings.
Sure. Perhaps I'll give you an opportunity just to have a read of that again now.
Yep. Thank you.
All right. And then I'll bring up the minutes for you where this letter was considered. So that's gwc.002.0016.0014. If we just show the first page, please. You'll see your name and third on the list there. And we'll just scroll down to page 11 and 12. If we could get those side by side, please. Now you'll see there at the bottom of page 11, under general business, that the chairman tabled that letter.
Yes.
Now, do you recall what discussion was had about that letter?
I'm not sure that I recall the specifics. In part, at least part of my memory of the letter is because I know Professor Daub.
I see.
So, and also the work of that health institute at Curtin Uni. That's the one, while it's not related to this, that really campaigned heavily anti-smoking.
Right.
So in WA, and was effective I can't recall in terms of the timing whether this was, you know, Professor Daub's next campaign was a little bit of what it felt like. And there's also not enough in the letter, I think, to be, well, certainly I expected the department responded.
Do you know if the department or
no,
the chairman responded to that letter?
No, I just expect that they would have. I mean, you don't get correspondence and not reply to it. But at the same time, yeah, so I don't know what was in the letter.
Or if in fact there was a letter in reply?
That's right.
Sure, okay. Now, in your witness statement at paragraph 42, you say that you're aware of the Australian Gambling Research Centre
Yes.
and the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation,
Yes.
and recall that their research was discussed from time to time. When you say their research, do you recall specifically what was discussed?
Not in the specifics. We did always have an eye to if there were any reports coming out of research that was undertaken. That certainly would not have been every meeting or even every other meeting. So sporadic in terms of what research reports were available at the time.
Okay, so there's no particular report that you can recall that was the subject of discussion?
Not in the specifics.
Okay. Now, just staying with your latest witness statement, at paragraph 46, you say that the consideration of problem gambling and the responsible service of gaming was not always, that those discussions were not always recorded in the minutes. Are you able to offer any explanation as to why this was the case?
I think one of the features of GWC minutes generally is that they're pretty sparse. It tends to be around the decision rather than very much commentary around conversations that happen to reach a decision.
Sure.
That's certainly in there in some regards, but you wouldn't count on it in all instances by any means.
All right. And did that sparseness ever cause you concern?
It did it on some occasions, and there were some occasions, although I couldn't be specific about it, where not only myself but other GWC members asked for the minutes to be expanded.
Expanded?
Yes.
And who was taking the minutes generally?
There was an executive officer. It wasn't always the same person,
And that was
but someone from the department.
From the department. Okay,
Yes.
thank you. I'll just move on to another topic related, the responsible service of gambling.
Yes.
Now, do you recall in late 2017 that the GWC requested that Crown Perth started providing, I'll refer to it as RSG,
Yes.
RSG statistics?
Yes, I do
Yes.
remember that.
Do you recall why that came about? Is there anything in particular that spurred that request?
I don't think that there was or I don't recall if there was a specific instance, but one of the members on the GWC at that time had a personal quest almost around responsible service of gambling and harm minimisation. And I think in fact, I recall that with his repeated raising of that issue, the Commission, the Gaming and Wagering Commission, felt it best to request specific consideration and a detailed report coming back to us, and that we start to receive those figures in terms of its application.
So do you recall that those statistics started being provided as part of a standing item
Yes.
on the agenda?
Yes.
All right. You spoke to a GWC member who was particularly vocal in this area. Do you recall who that was?
Mr Bovell.
Mr. Bovell. Thank you. Now, I'll just bring up the August 2019 agenda, just on the private screen, please. Just to take you to an example of these RSG statistics. That's GWC.0002.0016.0283. And if we could just go down to page 33, please.
Oh, and you can see there in terms of that Mr Bovell was actually an apology for that meeting, just by the by.
All right.
Yeah.
Oh, he was going to be an apology at that meeting.
Yeah.
Yes, I see that. Thank you. Now, page 33. If we could just scroll through this report through to page 38, please.
Yep.
Does that accord with your recollection of what these reports looked like?
Yes.
All right, I'll take you to a consideration of this particular report. Again, on the private screen, please, the minutes of that meeting, which is GWC.0002.0016.0286. And if we start with page 1, please. You can see your name third on the list there, Professor Hayward, as an attendee. And then if we just go down to page 3, and item 6.2, which is in reference to that RSG report that we were just looking at earlier.
Yes.
You'll see that members requested the following statistics. So how many third-party exclusion applications were sent, well, of the ones sent, how many returned, and then some statistics around since 1985, how many Crown Perth initiated permanent self-exclusions, how many are still in existence, essentially. You see that there?
Yes.
Now, at the September meeting, the GWC had Crown Perth's response to those queries. So if we could bring up the September 2019 agenda pack on the private screen, please. GWC.0002.0016.0287. And just if we go to item 5.5, so it's under business arising, starting at page 26, please. And you'll see they're prepared by Mr. Radis, just dealing with the GWC's inquiries. You'll notice that's in the same wording as the minutes there. Now, if we go to page 27, please. And this is the correspondence from Crown in response to those queries. And you'll see at the bottom of page 27 there, and that of the 110 third-party exclusions applications that were sent out over that period of time, so that's a period of 8.5 months there, that only 16 were returned. You see that in the table at the bottom of page 27?
Oh,
yes.
Yep.
And now if we're turning to page 28, the table there, so of the self-exclusions initiated between 1985 and 12 September 2019, there were 6,113.
Mm-hmm.
And of those, 3,013 have been revoked. You
Yes,
see that?
yes.
Now, would you agree that they are quite alarming or concerning statistics?
It looks like big numbers, but I think it needs to be compared with actual usage. So how many people would have visited, and then you get into the complication of maybe it's, you know, a group of people who go back time and time again because it's their main leisure activity, things like that. So it looks high, but I'm not too sure on the question of relative to what.
So you're looking at that now, you're thinking you want more information?
That could have been useful. I'm just not sure that the information that would have been useful could have been provided.
Sure. Okay. Now, I'll just bring up the minutes of that meeting. Again, that's on the private screen, please. GWC.002.0016.0288. And we see on page 1 that you're in attendance at this meeting. And if we scroll down to the item 5.5 on page 3, so that's dealing with Crown's letter that we just looked at. And you'll see there's no record of a debate. It was just simply a resolution to note
Yes.
the report. Do you recall the discussion about the response from Crown?
I don't recall that discussion as much as the GWC conversations around why those figures could be of interest to the GWC. That, my recollection at least, is that was around, we all wanted that information. But as you can see, Mr. Bovell was also there. I've already described it almost as a personal quest for him. He had, if my memory serves me well, he had a personal friend who had, through gambling, lost the house, lost the family, and he may have even self-harmed in that process. So it felt very close to Mr. Bovell. He made no secret of that. And some of the conversation was around, once again, who knows what the answer is, but around the level of responsibility or not on the individual who goes to a casino to play games.
Now, you said there Mr. Bovell had a personal quest. Do you think that he placed too much emphasis on this issue, or not, or there needed to be that much emphasis on it?
I think sometimes when he raised it, it was a bit hard to see the relevance. But for me, part of the benefit of a diversity of views around any board table is that you cover more issues. And while something might not have been something that you would raise, that doesn't mean it's not of interest when someone else does. So, as I say, sometimes it was a very stretched relevance that it would be raised, but I think it still was a good thing that it was raised.
Sure, okay. Now, seeing that the resolution was simply to note the report, as best you can recall, is it the case that nothing further was done once those statistics were received?
The statistics kept coming, and there were...
Sorry, I'll just clarify, just in relation to that particular letter. So GWC made the response. Tell us a bit more about these two components. They wrote back, the report is noted. Is it the case that that's where that matter ended?
In terms of the request for that information and the provision of that information, I think that was the end.
Okay.
It wasn't the end in terms of other information coming through at various times about RSG at Crown Perth.
All right. What other sorts of information did you gather from, did you request or receive from Crown regarding their RSG?
Over time, I have a recollection, hopefully accurate, of when RSG services were first introduced at Crown Perth. I remember that the GWC went on a visit to see those premises, how they would operate.
Did you go on that visit?
Yes.
Yes. Could you tell us about that visit and what it involved?
Mostly it was looking at the location and how accessible it was. You know, it's one thing to provide a service, including the counselling service that goes with RSG or can go with RSG, if no one can find their way to the office.
Sure.
You know, that kind of thing. It's interesting because when I go to functions at Crown, the area where I park walks past, I have to walk past there, and each time I think, okay, those offices are still there. They're very accessible. I could have ducked in from where I was walking through.
So easy to find.
Easy
you
to
were
find,
satisfied, yes.
easy to access. And apart from that initial visit, when it was first being established, I've not ever been into that particular office area. But having a look at that in terms of privacy provisions, you know, different rooms in terms of counselling for people, yeah. So that was a very early on aspect.
Sure. Could you recall what year that visit that you took part of, when that was?
Not without trawling through
Was
minutes,
it
I'm
perhaps
afraid.
earlier in your tenure than later in
Oh
your
yes,
tenure?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and we did from time to time. I'm thinking that it was probably on our request for further information. You know, there were more detailed reports that came through in terms of, you know, what does that look like? Even when the electronic surveillance was updated at Crown Perth in terms of the main gaming floor, part of that was how that technology could be used in terms of identifying people who might be either have or developing a gambling problem because of how long they were there, or
Sure.
you know, it's yeah.
And was that, you say it was people reviewing the footage to identify those people. Did you ever get any reports about that, about how many people might have been identified using that method?
Not that I recall.
Did you ever get any sort of feedback on whether that was a successful way to identify patrons that potentially have an issue?
The my recollection is that the upgraded, like massively upgraded surveillance systems were much more around the efficacy of the games themselves.
Sure. Do you recall the
than about
time period of
patrons.
this, Professor Hayward? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, I don't recall.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Now, are you familiar with the Problem Gambling Support Services Committee?
Yes.
And do you recall the GWC's power under the GWC Act to create subcommittees?
For that problem gambling, or for
Just
generally?
generally. Perhaps I'll bring up the legislation for you.
Yep.
If we could just bring up PUB.0004.005.0107. So I'm just bringing up the GWC Act. If we could go to page 30 and 31 side by side, please. So section 15 is what
Yes.
I was alluding to.
Yep. I do know that that's in the Act.
Sure.
And I think in my first witness statement, I indicated that, to my knowledge, we didn't ever establish any such committees.
Okay, so you didn't consider the Problem Gambling Support Services Committee, which I'm going to call the PGSSC.
Yes.
You didn't consider that, or no one told you about whether or not that was a subcommittee for the purposes of Section 15?
I didn't see it as a subcommittee of, that's, yeah, yes, what
And
you
why
said.
why do you say that you didn't see it that way?
My assumption would have been that any committees or subcommittees of the GWC you would have a fair representation of GWC members, and that one didn't.
I see.
It was important. It was reported to us periodically, but there weren't any ordinary members as part of it.
So you referred to there an assumption. So no one
Yes.
ever sat down and said to you or pointed you to, this is the PGSSC, it does this, this and this, it's a subcommittee
I
or
recall.
otherwise. Okay. If I could just bring up a document, please, on the private screen. This is the February 2020 agenda. So gwc.002.0016.0296. And I just want to draw your attention to item 9.2, which is on page 257, please.
Yes.
And if we just, so the recommendation here provided by M Vote, the regulatory officer, is that the Commission provide feedback on the PGSSC's strategic plan and seek membership nomination for the PGSSC from the Department of Communities and Mental Health Commission. If we could just scroll through that agenda item, please. Just to help refresh your memory of this matter. Do you recall seeing the strategic plan?
I've refreshed my memory of it over
Okay.
the last few days, yes.
Would you like me to scroll through that document now? No?
No.
All right. And if we could just bring up the minutes, please. That's gwc.002.0016.0297, starting on page 1, please. And we see your attendance there at that meeting. And just up page 10, please. To the resolution. Now you'll see there 9.2, item I, request the PGSSC to provide a briefing on meeting outcomes to the Commission after each meeting.
Yes.
Do you recall the discussion about this agenda item?
I'm not too sure if what I'm about to relay is specific to this item of this meeting, but some of the conversation that did happen around the PGSSC was questions about its effectiveness, the level of contribution. I think at that stage there was one of the groups that didn't ever turn up to any meetings. And it also melded with the conversations that we were otherwise having around harm minimisation and gambling addiction.
All right, you mentioned
yeah.
effectiveness there.
Yes.
Do you recall whether there was a view of the GWC as to its effectiveness or otherwise?
Look, I can only tell you my personal view, and that is that it seemed that these meetings happened, that there were particular services that were funded via that and through the contributions that we've seen outlined. But it otherwise seemed a bit moribund actually.
Was there anyone at that meeting, as best you can recall, that was leading that discussion around the PGSSC?
Not that I can recall.
All right. Now, having sat on the GWC since 2006 until the end of 2020, are you able to explain why it wasn't until February 2020 that this reporting requirement of the PGSSC came to be? That was the first part of that resolution I took you to?
Yes. For me, it was, some of it was about a lack of clarity that it was even happening, and some of it was around, while people wanted gambling help services provided and they needed to be funded, a lack of surety around what else the PGSSC actually did. So it wasn't high on the priority,
Sure.
simply because people didn't know enough about what it was doing.
We were eventually informed about what it was doing?
Yes, but I think that's what we're seeing in these last couple of documents.
So, as best at the time, do you recall what you were told about what it was doing?
Once again, it was really in terms of the help facilities and assistance provided via them, rather than that they did anything. I still don't recall anything earth-shattering that
Okay.
they could claim.
All right. Now, the PGSSC, so that resolution was made in February 2020, but they didn't actually meet in 2020. Was this ever communicated to the GWC?
No, not that I recall.
Okay, so there was no
kind of-
explanation given as to why it didn't meet.
No. No, in fact, I'll go further and say I wasn't aware that it didn't meet.
Right, okay. Now, I just want to turn to another topic, which is the FPOS machines at table games.
Yes.
Now, at paragraphs 47 and 48 of your statement, you talk about the introduction of the FPOS at the gaming tables.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at paragraph 48, now you're saying here that although you recognised, by you I mean the GWC, having FPOS would mean that there would no longer be a break in play. Are you saying that the GWC's hand was forced by the community who expected FPOS facilities?
I think that was certainly part of the case that was presented to the GWC.
And who presented?
No, I would be guessing.
Was it someone from the
honest.
department or someone from Crown or?
No, I really would be guessing.
Okay. Do you recall how the GWC informed itself of that community expectation?
Once again, I think that would have been included in whatever submission came to us to be able to support that
You
introduction.
don't recall perhaps whether there was a survey or anything undertaken, anything of that nature? Or what I'm really trying to get at is whether there was a presentation about it or whether it was the GWC were self-reflecting and thinking, oh, you know, if I was doing this, I would want to be able to have a cashless facility.
I think there was a presentation, but I couldn't be specific in that.
Now, moving on to another topic, services provided by the department. Now, do you recall your evidence on the last occasion that you didn't recall receiving documents identifying what services would be provided to the GWC and at what price? Do you recall that evidence? Or
I do recall that evidence, yes.
Now, in your latest witness statement at paragraph 10, you say in relation to financial statements of the GWC that the GWC was more focused on looking out for figures that looked out of kilter
Yes.
rather than interrogating the numbers.
Yep.
I want to ask you some questions about a particular GWC meeting in March 2009. Appreciating that it is a long time ago, but we'll do our best.
Okay, thank
I'll
you.
firstly take you to the agenda item. So that is GWC.007.001.0043. And if we could go to page 497, please. Monday-itis, I think. All right, here we go. So page 497, please. So this is agenda item number 9.2, looking at the budget for 2009-2010. Now, I just want to draw your attention to the second half of the page where it says in relation to the operating expenses. Mm-hmm. Now, you see there where it says recoupment of services received from RGL, Racing, Gaming and Liquor, has increased by $771,344 due to a review of fees and charges exercise undertaken by Racing, Gaming and Liquor. This figure is now a true indication of the costs and services provided by the department. You see that there?
Yes.
Now, if we could, I'll take you down to page 500 of that document. Perhaps if we could just pop back to 498 just to see the end of that agenda item paper. Sorry, I've caused that. Just so you can see that that was a paper prepared by Mr. Sargent.
Yes.
All right, and if we go to page 500 now, please. And if we just look at the cost of services under operating expenses,
yes.
You see that at the top. If we go down to the fourth item, recoupment for services received from Department of Racing, Gaming and Liquor, we can see there estimated 2008-2009, 3.187 million. And then annual budget for 2009-2010, 3.958 million. Do you see that?
Yes.
So that's that difference of the 771,000 I just took you to before. Do you agree that this seems to be a very large increase in service fees?
It certainly does at this point in time. I could not tell you that I recall the conversation, if any, at that time.
Okay. That was my next question. I'll just show you the minutes for completeness. So that's DLG 0008.0015.5549. And if we could start on page 4, which has the attendees, please. And you'll see second from the bottom that you were at that meeting.
Yep.
And if we could just scroll down to page 12, please, item 9.2. And you'll see that there was no debate recorded, but it was just to simply note, the resolution to note that report that I just took you to. Mm-hmm. Now, sitting here today, knowing that you don't have a recollection of interrogating those numbers at the time, do you think that it should have been something that was questioned?
Part of what I don't recall is the detail that came through. I would not be able to tell you, for instance, how the information around this is now a true record of what the costs actually are. I can't recall how or if.
So you never got like a breakdown of that
Look, not that
sum?
I can't recall if we did or we didn't. At this point in time, looking back, if we didn't, we certainly should have asked for it. But I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Now, keeping with the 2009 financial year, do you recall at that time whether the GWC had a website?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, perhaps if we could bring up Mr. Dorbay's letter, I think he made mention to a website in that letter.
Yes, he did.
I think, I'll just get a number. They might just assist because that's a date on that letter as to
Okay,
helping you answer
it's
that
about the
question.
same time.
Yes, so...
Because in his letter he talks to not being able to find that on the website.
That's as I'm recalling it too, but we'll just double check that.
Yep.
So that in the private screen, GWC.0002.0016.0012, pages 5 and 6 next to each other would be great, please. So on the first page of that letter, you'll see 3/4 of the way down, he says he's been trying to get some information on the GWC, but it's being difficult and the website is not functional. So that's at the 22nd of July,
Yep.
2010. So does that assist in your recollection whether there was a website at that time?
Yeah, look, I wouldn't argue with anybody who suggested a start date for that. It's not something that I went to.
All right. Could we please bring up the March 2010 agenda? That's GWC.0002.0016.0002_R. If we could turn to page 156, please. So this is one of the, I think, standard financial reports you receive.
Yes.
Now, so from page 156 through to 167, this is dealing with the budgets. If we could just scroll through that slowly, please. But has that comparative for previous financial years? When we get to page 163, if we could stop there. Now, looking at the operating expenses in 2008-2009, one of the items there is capital expenses, web design, actual spend 2008-2009, $260,000. Do you recall what that was for?
Not with any specific detail.
Do you recall whether there was, around that time, if there was any discussion around designing a website?
I'm assuming that there was, but I don't recall the specifics.
Oh. And just one final topic I wanted to explore with you. is, and I know you touched on this a bit with Mr. Future, but I'm not going to duplicate that discussion. It's on delegations.
Yes.
Now, you say in your witness statement at paragraph 14 that any exercise of delegated power was required to be reported at a subsequent meeting of the GWC, and you say that as far as you're aware that this happened.
Yes.
Now, my question is, was there a central repository or register, if you like, where all the exercises of delegated power were kept that members could look at any time?
I'm not aware of anything other than that what came through the record that was the agenda and minutes.
All right. Now, I just want to turn to December 2012,
Yes.
and I'd like to show you the agenda paper for that meeting. If we could please bring up on the private screen gwc.002.0016.0082. Just at page 201, please. Now, this is a paper relating to the change of a delegation, which was signed in April 2012. So I might just scroll through this document slowly, please. So this is the proposed delegation. Sorry, if we could go back to page 202. And you'll see here that with effect from the 18th of December 2012, all of the Commission's powers conferred by those 4 pieces of legislation. You see that there?
Yes.
Now, at page 205, so that was the delegation that was going to replace this one, which was entered into in April 2012. And you can see there, if we scroll through that slowly, that was quite prescriptive.
Yes.
Now, if we bring up the minutes relating to this item, so that's again on the private screen, please, gwc.002.0016.0083. And if we're starting on page 1, we can see you're in attendance at that meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And if we scroll down to page 7, we'll see that agenda item 8.2. And you'll see the resolution there, that the second resolution was to rescind the instrument of delegation of the 24th of April 2012.
Yes.
And then to effectively execute the new delegation.
Yep.
Are you able to recall why all of the powers were delegated on this occasion?
My understanding then and now is that delegations were actually only exercised on matters that were routine. Often when a matter, for instance, a request for in-principle approval for a new game, and the in-principle approval had already been given, so the delegation was the follow-up. I don't recall in checking what delegations had been exercised and were reported to us, alarm bells going off about, I don't know that that's what we actually meant when we said we'd delegate. I don't recall there being any of those alarm bells.
All right, thank you. I know I said that was the last topic, but just looking at the time, I think I can squeeze one more in quickly. We're staying in 2012. And this is going back to Crown. I want to go back to that EGM topic. Now, in 2012, do you recall that Crown applied to increase the number of EGMs at the casino? So they did it in 2010, which we talked about earlier. And do you recall them coming back in 2012 asking for a further increase?
I don't know that I could, that I would have said yes, it was definitely in 2012,
Sure.
but certainly that idea of them coming back,
Okay,
yes.
all right. I'll bring up the November 2012 minutes. GWC.002.0016.0081. So this was a meeting you were in attendance, you can see on that
Yes.
first page there. Item 4.2 on pages 2 and 3. I'm dealing with this in reverse. Usually I show the agenda and then the minutes, but I just wanted to deal with this in reverse. I think it might be quicker in this case. You'll see the resolution there on page 3, and that improve and increase in the number of EGMs from 2,000 to 2,500.
Yes.
And then also table games. Is that all coming back to you now?
In very general terms.
Sure, okay. Now, I'll go back to the agenda item when it was first tabled in August 2012. So that's GWC.002.0016.0069. Go to page 26, please. So this is a document prepared by someone at the Department of Racing, Gaming and Liquor. And there's a reference to an increase of 500 EGMs
Yes.
over 5 years,
Yep.
extra gaming tables and 8 new high roller tables. You see that?
Yep.
Now, if we go to page 27, please. And there's some reference there to some prevalence of gambling. The statistics again. Sorry, this whole second page rather, you'll see there's a reference to the prevalence of gambling and some statistics from 94 and 1999. And you'll see the sentence there in that first paragraph. These are the only surveys conducted in Western Australia.
Yep.
And if we just quickly bring up the November 2012 agenda, I'm going to just show you one of those impact assessments again that we looked at earlier, but this is a different impact assessment. So that's GWC.002.0016.0077. And if we could just go to page 25, please. So you'll see at the top of that document, it's an impact assessment for the proposed increase in gaming capacity. And there's a reference in this document in this page rather, to the 1999 findings in relation to prevalence. Perhaps I'll just give you a moment just to refamiliarise yourself with that document.
Yes.
Do you think it was appropriate at that time that a decision was made without updated research on the prevalence of problem gambling. So when we were talking about the 2010, it was 11
Yes.
years. So this is another 2 years on, 13 years later.
I think that lots of issues, not just this, would benefit from more frequent and more detailed research.
All right. And there's also a reference, you would have seen in there, to some comments of Senator Xenophon.
Yes.
Do you think those comments should have been taken into account by the GWC? Or do you know to what perhaps I'll ask this question first. Do you know if they were taken into account?
I can't recall if they were, but once again, we were very aware of how different WA is to other jurisdictions in terms of accessibility to machines.
So if I could, looking at it today, do you think the comments of Senator Xenophon should have been something taken into account in the GWC's consideration of increasing gaming, the EGMs and the table gaming?
Today I can say yes, but I also need to say I'm not sure that they weren't
All right.
for the double negative that's
So
in
yes,
that.
they should have been taken into account, or no, they shouldn't have?
Oh, I think they should have. I think anyone with a view, their comments ought to be considered. What I can't tell you is whether or not they were.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have no further questions. Thank you, Commissioner.
Oh, thanks very much, Ms Spencer. Council representing other parties have questions? No, there don't appear to be any. I just have a couple, Ms Hayward. Ms Spencer took you to a conversation about poker machines.
Yes.
Is it your view that changes to the machines, EGMs, over time have made it more difficult for the GWC to meet its obligation to keep poker machines out of Western Australia?
There's always been a question around acknowledging that the Act says there will not be poker machines, and that always being part of the consideration, things that come before the GWC seeking in principle approval can't look like poker machines. The degree to which there's actually a difference is something that would be an interesting unpicking, I think.
Right. Are you comfortable that the GWC has met its obligations to keep poker machines out of Western Australia?
Certainly in terms of that being a consideration at each time, yes.
Yeah. All right. I think that's it from my questions. Do you have any follow-up matters?
No, thank you, Commissioner.
Thanks, Joan. Mr Evans?
No, thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you very much. If there are no further questions, then Ms Hayward, I thank you very much for your evidence today. It's been of great help to the Commission. As I noted earlier, the other commissioners are in other sessions and they may have questions, so the summons will remain in place, but you can feel free to go with our thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we'll adjourn until 2 p.m.
All rise.